know, when a trend holds true through 11 weeks, so you see where we're going here, right? This is the 11th week of some kind of class this fall, and yet again, our boat is still tilting this way. Completely. And I'm going to take it as a personal affront because the lectern's over on this side, and there's nobody here. Hi. Still 3 rows back, but I appreciate it. Thanks.
This is a school thing.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our final class of the fall. Wasn't sure if I was going to get a yay or I don't know, just like a nothing, a no reaction. I don't know how to take that. That's okay. All right. So again, thank you for everybody that's been joining us throughout the fall. We did the whole big question series, and we've been doing the How-To Guide to Sharing Your Faith series, and we are going to end that this evening by talking about how to find the flaws, just by way of reminder of what got us here over the past several weeks. All right, I'm going to scooch a little forward here so I can actually see the screen. 3 weeks ago, we introduced the Columbo tactic. And we talked about how you can be much more effective in conversations by asking questions than by preaching at people and making statements. This does not just hold true for, I got news for you, for discussions about your faith, folks. This is good life advice. You want to be able to talk about things without starting a fight? This is how you do it, all right? By asking questions and having the other person do the talking. Now, you just need to know.
Teenage son, and he asked, "Why do you keep asking questions?"
Or they just keep asking questions back. You know, why? Why not? Why? Why not just go on over and over again? I had a friend when I was in elementary school that my parents, well, I mean, hate's a strong word, but, he'd come to the door and... Yeah, he'd come to the door and say, well, can Kenny, because I was Kenny when I was a kid, don't call me that. Can Kenny come out to play? And my mom would say, well, no, we're sitting down for dinner right now. Why? And that's how, it wasn't just why, it was always, why? Because we need to eat. Why? And constantly, he wouldn't stop over and over again. So, sometimes asking questions can be annoying and can cause a fight. So you have to know the right way to ask questions, to be generous and to be graceful about it. And we talked in that first week about our first Columbo question is always something along the lines of, what do you mean by that? Because that is a way, number one, of making sure you understand what the other person means, and so you're not misrepresenting them. And it also can be all you need to do sometimes, because sometimes they have no idea what they mean by that. They've just, they haven't really given any thought to be able to explain it. Then we went into the second Columbo question, where we said, how do you come to that conclusion? So once somebody explains their view, then you want to have some kind of variety of asking them why they think that way. How did they arrive at that particular belief? And again, many people have no idea how they arrived at the belief, and they can't explain that. Some can. And if they do give you an explanation, remember we talked about mentally you want to be thinking about, is what they're telling me possible, and it's what they're telling me plausible. And as you're thinking that through, as they're giving their explanation to you, that's going to help you prepare for the third use of the Columbo question, which was using questions to make a point. We talked about this being leading questions that lawyers do sometimes, but the idea is that you can use questions to kind of lead and direct a conversation toward a conclusion where you want it to go. So you're basically going for the same destination as you would be if you were just doing all the talking, but because you're not doing the talking, you're not the one putting cards on the table. They're the ones putting cards on the table, right? Because you're asking them questions, they're giving answers, they're arriving at these conclusions themselves. And when someone arrives at the conclusions themselves, they're going to be a lot more accepting of those conclusions than if someone else just tells them to them, okay? Because their resistance is not automatically going up at that point. And I did promise last week that another way you can use questions to make a point is often to point out flaws, errors, logical errors that people are making in their thinking. And there's a lot of very, very common ones. And that's what we're going to dive into more tonight. We're going to see how a lot of these questions can be used in specific contexts where we're going to be finding and graciously, that's still the key, graciously pointing out flaws in other people's reasoning. And again, by using questions, you're helping them come to that realization. You're not just telling them, oh, you just made this logical mistake. That's not going to get you anywhere in a face-to-face conversation, especially. All right, so I am going to cover specifically 5 tactics. Now, these are not formal philosophical names, although we'll talk about 1 or 2 of the formal philosophical names tonight. This is not a philosophy class. What's happened is Greg Kokel, the author of our book Tactics, and again, I'm going to make one last pitch. I make no money off of this. But this is the book that a lot of what we've been talking about, not all, but a lot of what we've been talking about the last 4 weeks comes from this book. There are a lot more of these flaw-finding tactics in this book than what we're going to cover tonight, because I can't cover them all in an hour to an hour and a half. So I do still strongly recommend that you go out and get this book. New 10th anniversary edition just came out within the past year or so. All right, but what he's done is he's come up with some kind of cute names for a lot of these things that, as you'll see as we go through, they're intended to kind of illustrate through the names, so kind of give you a hint of what you're looking for, because the name kind of describes the faulty reasoning, what's wrong with the reasoning, and why this is a mistake. All right, and so we're going to talk about 5 this evening. We're going to talk about what he calls the suicide tactic, which, to be honest with you, is probably the one that comes up the most often. And there's kind of 2 varieties of that, formal suicide and practical suicide. We'll talk about the difference between the 2, and I will give you an example of one of those that just came up in one of the comment sections in one of our videos like 3 days ago. Sibling rivalry is another we'll talk about. Infanticide, taking the roof off, and steamroller. Make sure that if you're ever discussing these tactics in conversation, that if somebody walks in on the middle of the conversation, you stop for a moment and explain to them what you're talking about, because if they just hear you talking about suicide and infanticide, you're going to have a lot of misunderstandings going on, okay? But you'll see why he calls them those as we go through. All right, so we're going to start out by talking about the suicide tactic, all right? The suicide tactic, the reason he calls it this, is because many statements that people make actually defeat themselves. The statement itself kind of proves that it can't be true of what they've actually said. The way he puts it is they set up some criteria of validity, that's something that needs to be true for them to be valid, and then they fail to meet their own criteria. All right, we're going to see a few examples of this, but one, for example, I've got 2 on the screen here. 1, all English sentences are false. And my personal favorite, whenever anybody remember standardized testing, this page intentionally left blank. All right? In your own words, somebody tell me what's wrong. Pick one of the statements or both. What's wrong with these statements?
Well, the second one, it's not blank. They wrote that on
The second one, at the moment you wrote this page intentionally left blank on the page isn't blank anymore, is it? So it's fun, it's cute, but it's also illogical. All right? What about the first one? All English sentences are false.
Well, that's a sentence.
It's a sentence in English, right? It's a sentence in English. So if all English sentences are false, then what about that sentence? It's false, right? Which means English sentences can be true, which just proves a statement. You see, that's an example of the suicide tactic, and it's recognizing when you have sentences and statements like this, the statement itself defeats itself. It sets up some criteria for truth. In this case, if it's in English, it's false. That's the statement it's making, right? But then it can't satisfy its own criteria. It's set up a criteria by which it fails itself. All right. So, in logical terms, all right, this is one I think 2 times I'll give you the actual logical term for this. It's what's called the law of non-contradiction. All of these things violate what's called the law of non-contradiction. In philosophy, the law of non-contradiction means that 2 opposite things cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense. An example I know Ravi Zacharias used to give, which I really love, is if you go out to a dinner party and you meet a young married couple, and they walk up to you, and you walk up to them. You heard a rumor that she was pregnant, so you walk up and say, "Hey, I hear that you're expecting a baby." And she says yes, and he says no. Can they both be telling the truth? They can't both be telling the truth. All right? She can't be pregnant and not pregnant at the same time. They can both be making statements of what their knowledge is. Maybe she didn't tell him. Maybe it's not his. All right? But she can't be pregnant and not pregnant at the same time. okay? She could be pregnant at one time and not pregnant at another time, all right? And maybe she can have a pregnant pause in her conversation while not having a baby. That's what I mean by in the same sense. Some words have multiple meanings, all right? But you cannot have two opposite things both be true at the same time and in the same sense. And so what these statements do that we're looking at through the suicide tactic is essentially they are advancing two opposite things at the same time, is what it is. So they violate the law of non-contradiction. All right, now, when a statement does this, I'm dropping my paper here. When a statement does this, I'm trying to see where I am on the thing. Greg Coughlan calls it formal suicide because it's a formal logical error. You'll understand the distinction in a minute between this and practical suicide. All right. If it violates the formal law of non-contradiction, we call that formal suicide. All right. How do you identify a statement that commits formal suicide, and how do you respond to it? Well, Greg Coughlan gives us 3 easy steps. Easy-ish. You need to practice them, obviously. The first thing you've got to do is listen to what's being said and try to identify the basic idea of the claim. Let's face it, people love to hide their views in all sorts of rhetorical flourish nowadays. They will say all sorts of things that sound great, all right, because they use nice positive language about it. But then if you break them down to what their actual meaning is, their core meaning is, you realize that maybe they're not as great as they sound, all right? And lots of times people don't like you doing that. But that's the first thing you've got to do is take whatever the statement is and just ask yourself in plain language, as plain as you can make it, what are they saying? What's the principle that this is actually advancing here, all right? And then step 2, you ask if that principle also would apply to the statement itself. You just think it through methodically, all right? And if it does, then what do you do? Not only is it on the screen, but it's what we've been talking about the entire last 4 weeks. You ask a question, right? You ask a question to point out the contradiction, which is what I was promising last week. That's a way you can use Columbo number 3, right? Asking questions to make a point. You're asking a question to illustrate the fact that their statement commits suicide. The statement defeats itself, all right? Let's have some examples so you can see how this actually plays out. All right, this is one that comes up very often. Somebody will say something along the lines of, you say the Bible is true, but in reality, there's no such thing as truth. This is postmodernism. We all invent our own truth. What's true? You ever heard somebody say, well, that's their truth, or this is my truth? It may be true for you, but it's not true for me. Well, that's great. Gravity, I don't care if you think it's true for you, you're still going to fall off the cliff, okay? That's just not the way truth works, all right? But a lot of people think that. They say there's no such thing as absolute truth that's true for everybody, all right? So you say the Bible's true, but really there is no such thing as truth, okay? What's the basic idea of this claim? In other words, what point is it trying to make? And that's what we just talked about. They're saying there is no absolute truth, all right? That's the principle that this person is espousing here, all right? Does that principle apply to the statement? Well, what do you think? Do you think they think their statement's true? Do you think they think that they're giving you an accurate description of reality? Sure they are, right? So the statement, there is no truth, in itself claims to be true. It claims to be a true description of reality. So this is one of the more entertaining ones. You can ask a very simple question. When somebody says there's no such thing as truth, you say, really, is that true? And it illustrates the problem, because what are they going to do? They could say yes, in which case they've just disproven their own statement, or they could say no, in which case they've admitted they're wrong, right? There's really no way out of that one because it's a formal suicide type situation. Another example. This one comes up a lot too. I see this one a lot. The Bible was written by men, and men make mistakes after all, so the Bible must be filled with errors. But let's remember what I was talking about, rhetorical flourish, the way people talk about it. Is it true that all humans make mistakes? Sure it is. All right, so you can see that it sounds kind of good, and this is where we need to boil down what the actual claim is. Let me ask you this way. Do humans always make mistakes? No. okay? You don't always make mistakes. So does the mere fact that the Bible was written by men mean it must have mistakes in it? It doesn't mean it has to, right? But that's the claim that they're making. And looking at it from a suicide standpoint, so that the claim is, if something was written or said by humans, it must have errors. That's the claim that they're making. Was their statement said by a human? They break their own. I mean, the person you're speaking to here is a human who is making a statement. And therefore, so there's a lot of different ways you can ask this. The one that Greg Kokel suggests in the book is, I'm curious, why do you think you're an exception to that rule? Well, what do you mean I'm an exception? Well, and that might require a little more explanation as they go through there. Well, I thought you were saying that everything that, humans say or write, is filled with errors, but you just said that. So, I mean, do you think what you said is filled with errors? It self-destructs. It works right back on itself. All right. Those are some hypothetical examples, although I will tell you in real life I've come across both of those. All right. Here is one from real life. All right. I don't know if anybody saw this. This was I did a podcast on Hey Ask Me Stuff episode about breaking down this lady's whole sermon. This is Dr. Rebecca Todd Peters. She is a professor of religious studies. Oh gosh, I forgot what college she teaches at now. And I had it on the episode, now I'm blanking on it. But she's also an ordained minister, pastor within the Presbyterian Church USA. And she was giving here a sermon. She was a guest speaker. She wasn't a regular pastor. Her full-time job is as the professor, but she does go around as an ordained pastor and fill in every now and then. So she was giving a sermon, and the long and short of it, she was on the board or somehow affiliated, I think, with Planned Parenthood, and so she was kind of attacking what we will call conservative Christianity as a general rule, and then she was applying it to the abortion argument as well. But the reason but this is not in this particular clip, but just to give you context, what I really did the podcast on, it is short on it as well, was the fact that she was arguing that we should be able to reinterpret the Bible, and that if we reinterpret the book of Genesis, God was lying to Adam and Eve, and the serpent was telling them the truth. Yeah, I think it's a pretty safe rule. Do you ever go to a Christian church and the pastor tells you not to trust God, but to trust Satan? That's not a church you should be in, okay? But that's what she's leading up to here. But I want you to listen to what she argues about Scripture, okay? And language, basically. She's making an argument about the meaning of language and how we can discover the meaning of language, and then we'll break it down with a basic idea. Does she establish a rule that would apply to her own statement? And figure out some questions we could ask. All right, let's watch. It's only about, 45 seconds to a minute long.
While we believe Scripture is sacred, what we mean when we say that is complicated. There's no unmediated Scripture. Even if we were to read it in the original language, as the act of reading itself is an act of interpretation. The meaning of those words is filtered through each of our own life experiences, our history, our culture. Bible verses don't hold meaning outside of time or culture, nor do they hold the same meaning across time and culture. They are always interpreted in the lived reality of faith communities.
Okay. If you ever hear anybody preach that, go find another church, okay? First of all, sometimes it sounds very flowy. This is what I'm saying, where the first step is to break down what is she actually saying, because she'll say it in big, flowy, religious-sounding language, right? And then we'll just all eat it up, all right? But first of all, what did she say about the Bible? What did you catch? Tell me, what did you hear? She said that what we mean by sacred is complicated. And the episode said, no, not really. You're just making it complicated,
And the meaning doesn't hold up over time.
The meaning doesn't hold up over time, right? What did she say? Why did she argue that? Okay. Yeah, Tom?
When the mere act of reading the Bible, whether you do it in the original language or in some translation, is an interaction between you and the words, and therefore it's personal. It's not something that can be taken globally.
Yeah, in the mere fact of reading it, there's some interpretation going on, like you were saying, based upon our culture and our experience that we bring into it. So I like the way you put it. So it's not something that can be extrapolated overall because it's that personal interpretation that you're bringing into it. All right. So, like I put here, a basic idea, the Bible doesn't have the same meaning across time because we all interpret what we read based on our culture and experiences. First of all, let me ask you, forget the first part of that statement. Second part of that statement, is that true? Do we interpret things based upon our culture and experiences? Absolutely. Yes, we do. Okay? It's absolutely true. Does that mean that the person who wrote something down in the first place didn't have an original meaning they intended by it?
No, it doesn't.
No, it doesn't mean that, does it? And that you're starting to see where hope you see where the logical error is here. What she's basically saying is because we all have, let's call them obstacles sometimes, that might get in the way of us discovering the original meaning of a text, that means the original doesn't have any meaning. Well, that doesn't follow whatsoever.
Well, even if we did all have a separate feeling about what we're reading, that doesn't change the meaning.
It doesn't change the meaning. Right.
I mean, I think when you look at the letters that St. Paul was writing to the Corinthians, that was part of their problem. They were diverging and going different directions based on what they thought.
What they thought.
And he corrected them. He brought them back. This is what this needs to be.
And he corrected them specifically. Also, remember, he would correct people. Well, somebody say you follow Apollos, some say you follow Paul. It's like, no. There's one meaning. It's Christ. Yeah, exactly. So, does her principle here then, could it be applied to her own statement? What I have here, is she also making statements?
Yes.
How do you think, especially considering the whole punchline here is that she is very, very pro-abortion. That's the argument she makes throughout this. How do you think she would feel if I said, yeah, you know what? Based upon my culture and my experiences, I'm going to go around telling people that the meaning of what you're saying is that you think all abortion should be outlawed and any doctor who does it should be imprisoned. Is that a fair interpretation of me to make for your statements? If she says, no, I got to read the question. Why not? Why not? That's exactly what you're saying you can do with the Bible. That somebody's individual culture, but see, when it's her own statements, she'll recognize that no, meaning is determined by the original author or the original speaker, right? Not by the reader. It's by the original speaker. And so if you turn that around and play that on her and take her own rule and try to apply it to her statements, I'd wager a bet she wouldn't like that too much, All right, do you see how that works out? Again, that is an example of formal suicide. All right. Practical suicide, the difference between formal suicide, it point blank violates the law of non-contradiction, all right? Practical suicide is a little different. Here's how Greg Kokel describes it. He says, some points of view fail the pragmatic test. They simply cannot work in real life application. When a person says, for example, I never say anything out loud, there is no logical contradiction, strictly speaking. Think about what I put in here, I kind of interjected, think about it. If you read that statement and somebody had written it down, would there be anything wrong with that statement? No, because it was written. However, it's just a practical one. He can't verbalize his conviction without refuting it. In other words, there's not a logical problem because if you just had that written down, it's not an issue. But if someone said that out loud, is there a problem? Yes. All right. That's practical suicide. All right. It's not necessarily a direct logical contradiction, but something about it can't be affirmed practically. All right. Here is an example. I took the screenshot yesterday, so it says 2 days ago, but now it was 3 days ago. The context here is there was a video that I put up where it was actually a clip from a Hey Ask Me Stuff episode. The Hey Ask Me Stuff episode got like 15 views. The clip from it got over 1,400 views, because in the clip I was disagreeing with John MacArthur. And apparently you're not allowed in the Christian church to disagree with John MacArthur. Because John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul, the late R.C. Sproul also, I was referencing where they had made the argument that God's love is not unconditional. All right, they're saying it's not true that God loves everyone because it says he hates sin and all this. So until you're saved, when you're unsaved, when you're still in your sins, God does not love you. And when you're saved, God does love you. And the point I was making is I don't think that's biblical. First of all, finish this sentence. For God so loved, thank you. Not part of the world, not some of the world. He loved the whole world. All right. I don't think, yes, there obviously is a distinguishing factor between saved and unsaved, right? But I don't think the dividing line is love. It's not a matter of whether God loves them. It's a matter of whether they have faith or not, right? Case in point, parents who have two kids. You got one kid who's behaving, the other kid who's not. Which one are you going to punish? The one that's not. Does that mean you don't love him anymore? No. If you didn't punish him, you wouldn't love him, right? Exactly. So the mere fact that, God treats people differently in some way does not per se mean he doesn't love everyone. Anyway, that's the overall argument that I was making, all right, in this clip. Well, this is one of the comments I got from somebody whose screen name is Jesus Savior Judge, so I'm going to assume this person is a Christian, okay? Frankly, most non-Christians wouldn't have even watched this video. It was kind of speaking to the Christian church to begin with. But here's what his comment was. He says, I agree with John. We are an enemy. John MacArthur, apparently on our first name basis, by the way. We are an enemy of God until repentance. Why don't you get your own message, buddy, and stop correcting other people? First of all, let's remember our ambassador approach, right? Where we're supposed to be good ambassadors and we're supposed to have the knowledge, the wisdom, and the manner. I could hold this up, first of all, as an example of a poor manner. All right, am I going to care? No, I don't care. But I'm going to suggest that don't go out and make this kind of snide comment to people. Come on. What does that accomplish? And to me, I see Christians doing things like this.
Remember, he's got judge.
He's got judge in his title. But as a fellow Christian, we're supposed to stand out from the world. And when we start making snide, sarcastic comments like that, we look the same as everybody else. We shouldn't do it. But forget about that for a minute. Let's look at what he said here. He said I should stop correcting other people. Or specifically in this case, I should stop correcting who? John MacArthur, right? All right. So what's the principle that he's advocating there?
Silence.
Silence? But he's saying it's morally wrong for me to do what?
Disagree.
To disagree, to correct another Christian, right? What do you think my response was? I'll give you a hint. It was a question.
Why do you say that?
Why do you think that?
There's a little more pointed than that. If it's wrong to correct fellow Christians, why'd you just correct me?
See, you gotta be good. Yeah.
Why'd you just correct me? This is practical suicide. All right? The statement itself didn't have any logical contradictions in it, but the moment he uttered it, he was defeating his principle was defeating his own statement. He broke his own rule. He's saying it was wrong for me to correct a fellow Christian, but in doing that, he was correcting a fellow Christian. You see? So it's an example. Needless to say, no response. It's been silence as crickets since then. I haven't heard a response back. But yeah, this could work very well in person. Again, you want to say it. It's hard sometimes with these interactions because, we all say, gotcha. That's never the point. That's never the point. You lose tone in online conversations, which does make it more challenging sometimes. So you do want to make sure you're being gracious about it. But that's an example of practical suicide. All right, next one. We're going to go to sibling rivalry. What's different about sibling rivalry? Well, first of all, you should know by the name sibling, we're talking about two, right? So whereas before we had one single statement, and within that one single statement, all right, there was a contradiction. With a sibling rivalry, so sometimes a conflict arises when a person raises two objections or has two views that are at odds with each other. And Greg Kokel gave an example here of a conversation he had where somebody who asked him, a Hindu man asked him, is Gandhi in heaven? And he said, because heaven would be a real bad place without someone who was as good as Gandhi was. All right? And so Greg Kokel asked him, well, who do you think goes to heaven? And he says, good people. Okay, well, what does that mean? What is good? Well, he said, being like a true Hindu, and if you remember from our previous class, we talked a little bit about this, good and bad are relative. There is no clear definition. Well, then how can Gandhi be good and deserve to be in heaven? And you see what I point out here is there's two conflicting beliefs that this person is advocating here. At the beginning, they're basically saying Gandhi is good and therefore should be in heaven, but they're also believing that there is no definition of what it means to be good. Well, if there's no strict definition of what good means, how can you say God meets that definition? You can't. It's a sibling rivalry. It's two different views that are directly contradictory of each other. All right? Another example here, we've talked a little bit about moral relativism. Moral relativism, again, is that belief that there is no absolute, we talked about with truth, people also talk about with moral truth, there's no absolute definition of right and wrong that applies to everybody. We all determine our own morality, or some will say our culture determines morality. Some will say our individuals, we all get to decide what our own morality is until you steal their wallet and then all of a sudden they change their views, but don't do that. But an example, you have a moral relativist, someone who will say something like right and wrong is a private affair. Who's to judge? Who's to judge? But then that same person comes up to you and says, how can God exist with so much evil in the world? It's a little trickier, but those two views are in conflict with each other. All right, their first one, what's the main point? What's the principle they're getting at? Morality is relative, meaning there is no objective right or wrong, just personal or cultural opinions. All right, nothing is right for everybody. It depends on what a culture believes or what a person believes. But then they go on to say there is evil in the world. They acknowledge there's something called evil. Well, wait a minute. What does that mean? Is that just your personal opinion? Then if that's the case, you're just saying, why does God exist when he allows things that I don't personally like? Which is clearly not what they're getting at, is it? They're saying there is an objective moral rule or standard of what something means to be evil. Certain things are evil for everybody, for all places and all times, which is why I don't like that God's allowing it. But then they turn around and say, but there is no such thing as objective morality. Those are two views that are held in conflict with each other. Here's a way of envisioning what I'm talking about. And this is another one of Greg Coughlan's examples from his book. How do you know whether someone's a good bowler? The score. What do you measure? How do you know what a good score is? 300. Why is 300 a good score?
Best you can do.
Best you can do, right? That's knocking down every single pin in every single frame. And so even if we can't achieve that, which I never have, I came close to 200 once. I think my highest score was like 180-something or 190-something in my entire bowling. Otherwise, I'd just be bragging about the number of times I broke 100. I'm not a good bowler, okay? But we have this idea, this standard, all right, of what perfection is. And the closer someone gets to that standard, we say the better they are, right? And the worse they are, further away they are from that standard, the worse they are. Picture that with morality now. What does it mean for someone to be good? Well, there has to be a perfect standard of what perfect goodness is. The closer they come to that, the better a person they are. The further away they are from that standard, the worse of a person they are, the more immoral of a person they are. All right? Well, when somebody says there's too much evil in the world, so I can't believe in God, they're assuming that there is some kind of moral standard that they can measure that against to say whether something's evil or whether it's not evil, right? But a moral relativist says, this doesn't exist. There is no moral standard. So in one breath, they're saying there is a moral standard. In another breath, they're saying there's not a moral standard. And those are in conflict with each other. All right? All right. Next one. Infanticide. Another entertaining one. All right? This one gets a little bit harder to see. All right? The way Greg Coughlan describes is sometimes someone's view is built on a prior concept that turns out to disqualify the view itself. Really funny example he gives. Tell me if you can see what the problem is with this one. There's a father writes a letter to his son, and in that letter, he says, son, if you didn't get this letter, please let me know, and I'll send another. I made a copy. What's wrong with that statement? If he didn't get the letter, he's not going to know that it was written, right? He's not going to know to ask. And so again, there's nothing logically wrong with that statement, but it's based upon the occurrence or the assumption of the occurrence of another event, all right, that turns out to disqualify what's being advocated, or in this case, asked for.
If you get there first, make an X. If I get there first, I'll rub it out.
There you go, yeah. All right, so a couple of examples we see in the apologetic world of infanticide. People will tell you that free will is an illusion. We don't actually, this is not just like online people. This is something that's actually held in a lot of scholarly circles. There's been philosophers getting up there and debating whether or not free will is an illusion. Greg Coughlan tells a story of one professor he got into a debate with. who was trying to say, no, we don't actually have free will. And that view is we think we make free choices, but in reality, every choice we make is determined by the circumstances that we face. All right? You're basically robots. You may be incredibly complex robots, but whatever inputs come into you will automatically determine through some really complicated formula what output comes out of you. It's so complicated that you think you're making free choices, but you're really not. And what Greg Koukl pointed out in this debate was the mere fact that his opponent was standing on that stage trying to convince people in the audience that free will was an illusion. He was assuming they had the free will to decide whether or not his view was right or wrong. All right? So he assumes the existence of that predecessor fact, the existence of free will, before he can even advance, at the time he even advanced his view. Again, the statement itself is not contradictory. However, what assumptions, I already answered that. Sorry, I forgot I asked you that. Never mind. This is my favorite one. People think they sound so intelligent when they ask this question, and it's really, really dumb. How do I know that I exist? Oh, philosophical, boom! There was a professor one time, I can't remember who, it might be an old wives' tale, that one of his students asked him, I gotta get the glasses out, I gotta let the professor look, hold on. They gotta get the full effect. All right, so the professor's up there, he's got his glasses on. Student says, Professor, how do I know that I exist? And the professor does this. And whom shall I say is asking? How do I know that I exist? In making the statement, he's assuming there's an I that he's talking about, right? Cogito ergo sum. Anybody translate that one for me? I think, therefore, that's what it means. All right? Similar concept. All right? The fact of the matter is you can't even, again, no logical contradiction there. But the whole statement depends upon a previous acknowledgement of his own existence. And you can't utter that. The moment he utters that, he's acknowledging his own existence. All right? So yeah, what question would you ask? I like that one. Whom should I say is asking? You know? Or the way I put it sometimes, and who is this I you're talking about? You know? All right. Taking the roof off. This is one that is very handy and so many views. This is just acknowledging a fact of human nature. And it's almost like a self-defense mechanism we use. All right? The way Greg Koukl describes what he calls taking the roof off is some points of view, if taken seriously, lead to unusual, even absurd conclusions. You might have heard this in philosophical terms. We call this reductio ad absurdum. Or some people just say reductio, which just means to reduce to the absurd. And what you're basically doing here is you're just taking someone at their word, finding out, again, what's the moral principle they're advocating, or what's the fact, the truth that they're advocating for, and just see where it leads. Because people live inconsistently all the time, all right? We hold mutually conflicting beliefs. We hold beliefs in one area of our lives that if we were being consistent should affect other areas of our lives as well, but we're not comfortable with where it's going to tell us what we should do over here. So the way Greg Koukl describes it is we almost put like a roof on our reasoning, all right? A roof that we can't get past. So when we're thinking through the logical consequences of our beliefs, we're only willing to go so far. And so we put this roof on them so we don't have to be confronted with the reality of where that belief might actually carry us. And so our job in those situations is to very gracefully take that roof off and show people where the logical consequences of their beliefs lead them, because it's probably not somewhere they would want to go. I mean, the example would be moral relativism. If somebody says there's no such thing as absolute moral truth, there's no absolute right, there's no absolute wrong, steal their wallet, take the roof off. Don't do that. But you get my point. What you're doing, what that would do is that would very forcefully demonstrate to them that their belief leads to a logical conclusion they would not want to follow. They would not want to go, because honestly, if they're true to their beliefs, somebody steals their wallet, their reaction should just be, well, I guess they thought it was okay. I may think it's not okay, but they thought it was, so I guess I can't complain. But nobody ever says that. Nobody ever says that. All right. How do you take the roof off? And we will see some examples here in a minute. Again, Greg Koukl gives 3 steps to taking the roof off. Number 1, just like we've been talking about, you want to ask yourself what that person's basic, specific claim is. How do you do that? Oh, look, Columbo number 1. What do you mean by that? Right? This is why these questions are important. What do you mean by that? Once you identified what the basic core belief is, I like the language he uses, take it for a test drive. See where it goes, right? Just ask yourself, if I follow this principle that they're trying to convince me of, if I follow it consistently, what are the consequences? And then if you find a problem, use questions to point it out. All right? Here's a very common example. I'm going to show you a video here in a second, a YouTube short we did a little while ago, where a very famous atheist was advocating for this view. Argument is often made, same-sex relationships are common in the animal kingdom. See them all the time in different animal species. So they're natural, and they must be moral. All right? So again, just break it down. What is the basic principle that this person is advocating for? If you put it in your own words.
LGBT.
Right, but why? Why are they saying that it's okay, that these relationships are okay?
Because it happens in the animal kingdom,
Because
so it must be natural.
it happens in the animal kingdom, not just so it must be natural, but the implication is, therefore, it must be moral, right? It must be okay. If it happens in the animal kingdom, it must be okay. Because that's what they're advocating for, right? They want to say these are good moral relationships. Look, they happen in the animal kingdom. So they must be all right.
And
All right.
so I would say, so are we animals.
Well, I'm going to show you a little YouTube short I did. All right? It just isn't a question answer because it's just me talking and responding to you. But while you listen to it, I want you to be thinking about this last question down here. What does it lead to if we follow that view consistently? The view is, what's being advocated is, if you see it in the animal kingdom, it must be okay. All right?
Homosexuality is perfectly natural. In all animal species, almost it's natural. It occurs with a 10% frequency. Why would a God who thought it was a sin make it natural among all species? I don't think the sheep, by the way, which 10% of sheep are long-term homosexual relationships. Okay? Why would a God who thought it was a sin create sheep who don't have a soul, who aren't able to think about it, be homosexual?
You know, up to 1 out of every 3 species of mammal has been known to kill and eat their young. The praying mantis and some varieties of spiders will actually kill and eat their mates. The male lion only does about 10% of the hunting and leaves the rest of the work to the women. And of course, howler monkeys and chimpanzees have been known to fling their feces. I don't know, but I think maybe the behavior of the animal kingdom isn't the best standard for human morality. What's funny, this is the most watched YouTube short on our channel, and it gives me measurements about how many likes versus dislikes it's got. Out of everybody that's either clicked like or dislike, only I think about 37% have clicked like, which means part of the popularity of this is people, for one reason or another, don't like what I'm saying. You know, is that because they don't like where it's going, where it's leading? Is that just because, obviously, I'm attacking a view that's very, very held dear to them? But again, let's take that for a test drive. If the principle that is being advocated, and that was Lawrence Krauss, by the way, he's a very famous atheist. If the principle being advocated for is, if it's in the animal kingdom, so it must be okay, where does that lead us?
Human beings.
What's that?
Human beings.
Human beings? What?
Lions also, male lions also, I guess that is a lion, kill the cubs when they take over a pride.
Kill the cubs when they take over the pride. Is that?
That's the only way that they can get the females into estrus.
So, do you think that's something we should be doing morally here? Should we be killing our young?
You know, if you have stepchildren, and you don't like
I'm just trying to make sure you're not advocating for this moral principle. That's all.
to make you mad first.
You know, if I was actually in debate stage with Dr. Krauss, I would love to ask him if he would think that it would be morally appropriate for me, rather than, you know, articulating a response to his viewpoint, just to fling poop at him. I mean, why not? If that's the moral principle, it should be perfectly acceptable for me to do that, right? Because you see that in the animal kingdom. reductio ad absurdum, taking the roof off. Again, you do it gracefully. We're having fun here, all right? I wouldn't really do that. But you do.
You wouldn't explain it, but anyway.
But you could ask a question. Well, I'm just curious if that's the standard, if it's okay because we see it in the animal kingdom, then just bring up one of the examples. I mean, I'm curious what your thoughts are, like the praying mantis that killed its mate after they engage in intercourse. Is that also a standard that we should be living by? And if they, of course, will say no, say, well, I'm a little confused then. So then what's the distinction between the two? Because that seemed to be the rule that you were advocating in the other situation. What's different about it? You know, so you can do it gracefully, you can do it respectfully, but still, take the roof off. All right, we saw back in the class on abortion, we saw another example of a tactic called that involves taking the roof off. And I don't know if anybody's going to recognize it, but we called it, I didn't call it, trot out the toddler. If anybody remembers that, trot out the toddler is an example of taking the roof off. All right. As Greg Kokel describes it, virtually every argument in favor of abortion, not all, we talked about the bodily autonomy argument, which is frankly a better argument, still fails, but it's a better argument. But virtually every other argument, I'll say, in favor of abortion could equally justify killing newborns if pressed to its logical conclusion. And if you remember from that class, I brought up the SLED test to kind of categorize these different objections, or these, not objections, these arguments that are made in favor of abortion. And we said they all are based on, generally speaking, one of these four categories: a difference in size, a difference in level of development, a difference in environment, or a difference in degree of dependency. All right. To give you an example of, so you see how this is taking the roof off, people will say things like abortion is fine because the unborn doesn't even have X yet. A heartbeat, a circulatory system, brain waves. Fill in whatever the X is. All right. Well, again, we ask, what's the main point there? All right. The unborn isn't as developed as the born is, right? That's the principle that's being advocated. Take the roof off. Well, a 2-year-old's still developing too and doesn't have all the physical characteristics of an adult. Does that mean we can kill a 2-year-old? Trot out the toddler, right? It's taking the roof off. That's all it is. All right. We could also have used the taking the roof off tactic in addressing the video we watched earlier of Dr. Rebecca Todd Peters to show that if we apply her principle consistently, remember her principle is basically everything's interpreted, so there's no objective meaning to language, then it would lead to a conclusion that she would likely find absurd, meaning even her own words don't have objective meaning, right? It's this different approach where you can get to the same destination, basically. And Jesus did it too. Don't you love it when we can pull this out, okay? Jesus took the roof off while talking to the Pharisees. Somebody want to read for us here Matthew chapter 12, verses 24 through 28.
But when the Pharisees heard this, they said, "It is only by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, that this fellow drives out demons." Jesus knew their thoughts and said to them, "Every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city or household divided against itself will not stand. If Satan drives out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then can his kingdom stand? And if I drive out demons by Beelzebub, by whom do your people drive them out? So then they will be your judges. But if it is by the Spirit of God that I drive out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you."
All right, let's break down what Jesus did here. All right, the claim that he was responding to was that Jesus was casting out demons by the power of Satan. What did he do? He pointed out that if we take that claim to its logical conclusion, it leads to an absurd result. If Jesus' power to cast out demons comes from Satan, then Satan is working to destroy his own kingdom, taking the roof off. Therefore, the conclusion we come to is Jesus' power must not come from Satan, but from God, because God's the one who opposes Satan, right? And anyone who opposes Jesus is opposing God. It's taking the roof off. We just show reductio ad absurdum, showing how it leads to absurd results. All right. Here is the tactic, the last one we're going to talk about this evening, spend a little more time on it, because this is one every single person here wants to know how to handle, because we've all dealt with people like this. And they're called steamrollers. All right? Once in a while, you will encounter people who try to overpower you. They don't overwhelm you with facts or arguments. Rather, they roll over you with the force of their personalities. Their challenges come quickly, one after another, keeping you from collecting your wits and giving a thoughtful answer. Steamrollers have a defining characteristic. They constantly interrupt. As soon as you begin to answer, they hear something they don't like in your explanation, interrupt, then pile on another objection or challenge. Has anyone ever dealt with a person like that? Sure. All right. At some point, you just realize they're probably more interested in hearing themselves speak than they are actually hearing your answers. But they become very forceful. They're constantly interrupting. And that's hard to navigate, isn't it? Because it can make us lose our temper sometimes, can't it? So how do we handle this type of situation? All right. 3 simple steps, folks. Step number 1, and we'll break them all down here in a minute. Step number 1, stop him. Step number 2, shame him. Step number 3, leave him. All right? Here's what that means. Step number 1, stop him. Your first move should be a genial, a friendly request for courtesy. Stop the intrusion by momentarily putting the discussion on pause, then briefly request permission to continue your point without being interrupted. You might even be able just to hold up a hand for a second. Sometimes you might need a little visual reminder so they'll stop talking, because they've already interrupted you. So if you just start talking, they might not get the hint. You just gotta hold on a second, something like that, politely. Is it okay if I take a few minutes to answer your questions before you ask me another one? Just something like that. Polite, respectful, but that's the simplest way. You're trying to be polite and just see, because lots of times people might just be doing this inadvertently. All right, as politely as you can, just stop them and then try to get things back on track. Let's say that doesn't work, because it doesn't always work. You do them, they're fine, they agree to it. Yeah, go ahead. You go ahead and finish your answer. They've committed to it, right? They said it's okay for you to go on, and then they interrupt again. Now what do? Shame him. Now does this mean shame? No. But it does mean you're going to be a little more direct this time around. Remember, the first time, we didn't really even say anything about being interrupted, right? Not per se. We just said, hey, is it okay if I finish this before you ask me something else? Okay, cool. All right, good. If the steamroller breaks trust with your agreement, or if you can't succeed in stopping him in the first place to negotiate an orderly conversation, you hold up your hand and they smack him down, all right? You want to shame him for his bad manners, but you want to do it with integrity. 3 tips that Greg Koukl gives to how to do this. Number 1, use their name. You'd be amazed how much headway you can get just by addressing someone by name. Politely, but it gets their attention, all right? People have an instinctive attraction to their name. So the moment you say it, it's going to cause them to stop and listen for a moment, all right? Ignore any additional questions. That's what they love to do. Lots of times when I'm dealing with people like this is because they don't have an answer for what I'm saying. So what they're trying to do is just to change the subject really quickly, to constantly keep me so that they never have to actually address the points that I'm making, all right? Don't fall down the trap of going down other rabbit trails. Ignore any other points they bring up. And now you do address the steamroller issue directly. Still respectfully, but directly. An example of what he gave in the book is something like this. You seem to keep interrupting me. Now, I'm happy to answer your question if you really want an answer. Now, if you don't, that's fine. If you just want to talk, then I can listen to what you want to say. But if you actually want an answer to the questions you're asking me, then I need to be able to give my answer without interruptions. Is that okay? All right. So now we're directly addressing the fact that you are getting interrupted. You're still trying to be as gracious as you can be. And I will quite often say something like this, where I'll just say, hey, look, if you want to talk, that's fine. I'll listen to you. Go ahead if that's all you want to do. But you're asking me some questions, so it seems to me like you wanted to hear or were interested in hearing what I had to say, and I'm willing to do that too, but you just got to let me do it. Something along those lines. So that's shaming him. Last but not least, leave him. All right? If the steamroller won't let you answer, listen politely until he's finished, then drop it. Wisdom dictates not wasting time with this kind of person. Somebody want to read for me Matthew 7:6 right here in the middle.
Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls
Do not cast your pearls among swine, right? This is what Jesus is getting at here. All right? As Greg Koukl puts it, he says, be generous with the truth, except with someone who shows utter contempt for the precious gift being offered. He will simply trample it in the mud and then viciously turn on you. At some point, all right, it becomes very, very clear that the person you're talking to is not interested in a conversation at all. You're wasting your time. With one exception. There's one time when you might consider continuing the conversation. Anybody want to guess when it is? What do you think?
When there's an audience.
When there's an audience, look, you win the brownie, but you can have one of my cookies. Yeah, I did. But you were paying attention last week when we talked about it. When there's an audience. Exactly. And I give an example here of something you can do to, if you want to end the conversation, you say something like, I'm having a hard time getting my point across, so I'm going to let this go for now. Thanks for your thoughts. All right, polite way of ending it. But yeah, the one time you might consider still going is if there's an audience. Because at that point, you're not really talking to that person anymore. You're talking to all of them. As again, I like the way Greg Koukl puts it, sometimes a word spoken to a hardened heart bounces off and hits a soft one. All right. Now, are there still going to be times eventually when you kind of have to say, we're done? Sure, there are. But if in that situation where there actually are people listening, like pastors that walk through the room and try to think you don't notice them, at that point in time, yeah, we're like almost done with the class and she comes in. She's sitting on the unbalanced side. Yeah, this whole class is going this way because everybody always sits over here. Nobody wants to be by me. Anyway, but yeah, that's the one time when even if it's clear you're dealing with a steamroller, even if it's clear that they're not interested in anything you're saying, you might still want to continue the conversation a little bit longer because if there's other people listening, they may be listening to what you're saying. I'm going to read it again because I just love this quote. I love the way he put this, right? Sometimes a word spoken to a hardened heart bounces off and hits a soft one. So if there are people around that are listening, you may be far more effective with them. All right. So, wrapping it all up, all right, what we talked about from the beginning. I've given you a lot of different tactics. We talked about the Columbo tactic, right? We've talked about the 3 different uses of it. The first question was, what do you mean by that? Come on. First question, asking somebody, what do you mean by that? Second question was, how did you come to that conclusion? And the third one wasn't really a question. It was a way to use questions, and what was it? To make a point, right? And then we looked through a number of different tactics as Greg Koukl describes them, but basically just errors in thinking, poor thinking that people make, and ways to graciously address them, all right? Are you going to know all of this and be second nature right off the bat? No, you didn't even remember the first Columbo question 2 seconds ago. All right, so, yeah. We're going to be done. We've only been here like an hour. You can't complain. So you do need to practice. Remember, we talked a little bit about this last week. It is okay to practice beforehand, all right? To go through and to think through and get a conversation partner and talk out loud and figure out what am I going to say in this situation? How would I express myself? More than anything, that can also help you, I find, just with that third one, that manner part, to make sure that you're not coming across like a jerk, that you actually are exhibiting the love of Christ in the way you interact with people. But practicing alone is no substitute for the real thing. The Great Commission does not say, sit in your living room and talk about the gospel to yourself, okay? Go out into the world. You've got to go out and start sharing your faith. And then you're going to hear people disagree with you and throw things at you that maybe you never heard before. Great. What's an okay answer? What is always an acceptable answer? I don't know. Right. Always an acceptable answer. I'll look into it. Let me get back to you. Let me go talk to somebody, whatever it may be. And then, but that's how you learn, because then you go back and you do talk to somebody, you do look it up, you do learn, and hopefully you'll get a chance to talk to that person again. Even if you don't, you're prepared for the next time someone brings it up. Because again, I've told you, there are a limited number of reasons people object to Christianity. There are. There are different varieties, they dress them up differently, but there's really a limited number of reasons that people give. I mean, we've been around for 2,000 years. We're pretty much out of new ideas, right? And then after you go out and engage with people and spread the gospel and share your faith, come back and evaluate each discussion. Check to see how you did. All right? And I gave you a 3-pronged method. Well, Greg Kokel gave it. I just repeated it for how to do that. Number 1, ask yourself, did I have the knowledge for the task? If somebody asked me why Jesus is the only way, did I know? Not just that Jesus is the only way, did I know why Jesus is the only way? All right? Or any of the other things, whatever the topic was, did I have the knowledge that was up to the task? Did I have the wisdom? This is where you're evaluating, did I make any tactical errors? Did I start just talking to somebody when a question could have worked better? You know? And lastly, did I have the right manner? Was I a good ambassador? Did I reflect Christ in the way I treated people? Just like we talked about at the beginning of, or earlier in the class, God loves everybody. You know, there's distinguishing marks between us as far as whether we have faith or whether we don't have faith, certainly. But he still loves us. So did people feel that love through you as you were talking to them or not? Okay? That's how you act. So practice, engage, evaluate. All right? That's how you're going to get, not just, I don't want to say better. That sounds, that better makes it sound like it's within your control, and it's not. Remember we talked about when you go out and you share your faith with someone. What's that? You become more comfortable, yes. Because ultimately, whether or not someone comes to faith in Christ is not up to you. Because unless the Holy Spirit has softened their heart, it doesn't matter. If Jesus comes down, stands right in front of them, knocks them on the head and says, believe in me, they're not going to believe it. I say that kind of jokingly, but I've actually had atheists flat out tell me that it doesn't matter what they see, they will never believe. You know, and so unless that heart is softened, it doesn't matter what you do. It's not up to you. Your job is to be obedient to what God tells you to do, because not only might he use you as an agent to reach someone, but it also strengthens your faith. It strengthens your faith as you go along. So practice, engage, and evaluate as you go through. All right. So next week, there ain't no next week. We're done. All right, we're finished. That's the finish line. We've crossed it, but we are worshiping at 6:30 next week. All right, thank you all. Have a good night.